In July 1959, the narrow streets of Manhattan, New York, were sizzling under the blazing sun. Mark Connor, sweat dripping down his face, walked briskly toward the steps in front of his apartment building. The heat was oppressive, but what weighed more heavily on Mark's mind were the thoughts that had been troubling him for days. The secret experiments he had conducted in the past continued to haunt him. On the front steps of the apartment, little George McKay, as usual, sat by himself, mumbling something under his breath. This small boy had carved out a short yet meaningful place in Mark's life. George was a child trying to grow up amidst his father's war-induced trauma and his mother's battle with depression. Mark approached young George, pulling a pack of gum from his pocket and handing it to him. George's eyes lit up with joy. "Thank you, Mr. Connor," he said, grabbing the gum and running off in a hurry. This innocent moment provided a brief respite for Mark's chaotic mind. However, the peace was short-lived. Mark was aware that the government had been monitoring him and was intent on erasing his memory to prevent the leak of any sensitive information regarding the time travel experiments he had been part of. Time was a dangerous concept, and Mark had realized that he had to fix things before it was too late. But there was no time left to correct the past, only to leave a trace for the future. In 2024, George McKay looked back at most of his life as a series of lost years. A broken man, he found himself sitting in a quiet bar in a corner of Manhattan, haunted by the ghosts of his past. Now in his 50s, George was still trying to understand where life had taken him. That night, as he sat in the bar, the young man sitting across from him caught his attention. There was something familiar about his face that sparked a distant memory in George's mind. The young man pulled out a pack of gum from his pocket and popped a piece into his mouth. This simple act triggered a long-forgotten memory in George's mind. The man who had given him gum as a child in front of the apartment, Mark Connor. But how could this be? Mark Connor should have disappeared years ago. When George made eye contact with the young man, the doubts in his heart gave way to fear. It was impossible for Mark Connor to look so young and vibrant. The young man, noticing George's confusion, smiled at him. "You remember me, don't you, George?" he asked. That simple question put all the pieces together in George's mind. Yes, the person sitting across from him was indeed Mark Connor, but he looked exactly the same age as he did in 1959. This was the greatest mystery of George's life, and now he had to solve it. Mark began to explain to George about the time travel experiments and the consciousness transfer technology he had worked on. This technology, which he had developed in the 1950s, made it possible to create a copy of a human consciousness and send it to the future. However, with the government monitoring him and the dangerous side effects of the experiments becoming apparent, this technology had to remain a secret. Mark had come to the future to prevent a catastrophe from happening in the past. Mark explained to George the existence of parallel universes and how the time travel experiments had caused anomalies in these universes. During his experiments in 1959, Mark had accidentally breached one of these parallel universes, creating a time anomaly there. This anomaly had triggered a series of events that had significantly altered George's life. George realized that to correct these anomalies and rebuild his life, he would have to work with Mark. However, this process would require great sacrifices. Mark told George that they needed to go back in time and fix the mistakes Mark had made in the past. As Mark and George prepared to return to the past, the challenges they faced grew by the day. The paradoxes that could arise during time travel and the unstable nature of parallel universes posed great dangers to them. With George's help, Mark managed to overcome these dangers once he found a way to transfer his consciousness back to the past. However, when they finally returned to the past, the greatest challenge Mark faced was confronting his own mistakes and correcting them. George stood by Mark, supporting him as they worked together to repair the rupture in time that they had created. Once the flow of time was restored to normal, George and Mark had both learned valuable lessons from the mistakes of their pasts. For the first time in his life, George found a true purpose: to mend the past and build the future. As for Mark, he had corrected the damage his consciousness copy had caused in the past and restored the balance of time. However, once everything was settled, Mark's consciousness copy disappeared without a trace. Afterward, George decided to rebuild his life anew. The legacy Mark left behind had created a lasting change in George's life. Years later, George continued his life as a man who had finally returned to the world, free from the ghosts of his past. Mark Connor's story remained suspended at the edge of time, living on in George's memory. And who knows, perhaps this story awaits to be rewritten in another parallel universe, somewhere in the folds of time.